Nobody's going to watch this video, but given the new release, I just couldn't fucking help myself. Today, we're going to talk about one of my favorite bands of all time. Yes, they're British and an indie band. Go ahead and make your jokes. Everything is an art rock band hailing from Manchester. They're also clearly big Radiohead fans, so that tells you all you need to know. I've been a big fan of them since like 2017 or so, and I thought it would be interesting to make a video talking in depth about their music because a lot of it is really rich in meaning. It's very accessible while still being relatively experimental with its sound. None of the albums these guys have released sound similar in any way imaginable, and I don't think this is helped by the fact that the lead singer, Jonathan Higgs, has some vocal delivery that is, for lack of a better term, an acquired taste. So in the same vein as my Mr. Bungle video, I will be taking the entirety of their discography and ranking it from the album I thought was their absolute worst to my personal favorite. Keep in mind that none of these albums are ones I hate. If the obnoxious comments from my Mr. Bungle video were any indicator, it's that I need to clarify that this is not me shitting on everything's music. I think they're amazing even at their worst. It's just my opinion, a personal ranking on each album with a justification for why, because it's fun. I saw Fantano do this exact bit with Kanye West, so I thought it would be a good idea to cover some of my favorite artists with the same gimmick. So without further ado, let's get into the ranking. This may come as no surprise to anybody, but the worst album, in my opinion at least, is Re-Animator. This is hardly an opinion you haven't heard before, as it seems it's generally agreed to be everything's worst work to date. I won't spend a lot of time talking about it because I don't find myself drawn to it enough to re-listen. I can maybe count on one hand the number of tracks that were memorable enough for me to give them another go, but while some people seem to relatively enjoy Re-Animator, I find myself enjoying less and less with every go. Now, there is a lot to enjoy with this album. Arch Enemy is pretty catchy with these nice horns and funky drum beat, but again, Higgs' vocal performance feels really weak and just completely takes away from the song. I honestly would have rather they just kept it as an instrumental. Planets goes pretty damn hard with this bouncy synth that builds and builds as the track goes on and gets more detailed. This is fortunately where his vocal delivery is a lot more energetic and passionate. I like that the track gets more chaotic as it goes, and I especially adore that ascending guitar melody during the chorus with the crazy blown out bass and tight synths made even better by the backup vocals from the other members. Lost Power is one of the stronger tracks on the listing with this mesmerizing guitar and funky drums. It's like I'm being bombarded with digital bliss. Black Hyena kind of reminds me of Tyler the Creator's Who Dat Boy with this unhinged ringing atmosphere at the start. I like Higgs' low, somewhat emotional delivery. Like many of the other tracks, it also has a pretty damn strong hook with thick bass and great percussion. Big Climb has a nice twinkling digital beat with some fast-paced delivery and flow from Higgs. It goes pretty damn hard with the subtle clicks and rings before you get dropped into this rapturous wall of sound with one of the best choruses on the listing yet. There's a lot to like about this album, but a lot of the tracks here, almost too many, just don't have any sort of impact on me. In Birdsong has this really grating and flat tone, which isn't helped by the fact that the music video has some of the grossest looking effects in Blender I've ever seen. The drums sound so quiet and distant, not to mention totally out of sync, like it's just jumping around without even trying to fit into the groove. Higgs sounds like he's literally about to fall asleep with some of the most bland vocal performances imaginable. Now, I would say Violent Sun is a much more decent attempt at this kind of new wave track. It has a similar funky flow with the fast-paced drums and soaring guitar strums, but Higgs actually sounds pretty damn good on this one as well. It's very dramatic and moody, but I love the reverb and psychedelic inflections. It sounds very beautiful, especially with that fantastic bridge, but despite this, Moonlight kind of reminds me of Coldplay, maybe a little Muse in there as well. Higgs has this very unique effect on his voice with these stable drum taps and straightforward guitar fills. It's not that interesting, it kind of sounds basic and unmemorable. It Was a Monstering has this obnoxious opening where they try to be experimental with these super grating and irritating moans and synths completely suffocated in reverb. It's genuinely hard to stomach, even with the drums trying their best to make it resemble a song. Then it gets replaced with these nice, clean guitar notes as Higgs gives these tired vocals, kind of reminding me of Radiohead a little bit. It's definitely one of the more enjoyable tracks on the listing for sure, but that opening just drives me nuts. It also comes back for the bridge in small waves, and I just don't know why they insisted on sampling this. Lord of the Trapdoor doesn't exactly help make the album less generic. The guitars just go back and forth between these two notes. It's really fucking boring, and I just don't care enough about it to bother listening to it all the way through with the lack of progression and just generally bleak tone. The problem with this particular album is that they do try a lot of new things, so their highs are very high while the lows are very low. There are moments of promise that I think are amazing, but there's also a lot of duds that really bring it down. To me, an album is only good in its consistency when there are multiple really fucking great songs on the same listing and I'm just baffled. But only about half of the tracks on Re-Animator felt worthwhile, and the rest just do nothing for me. Even the aesthetic of the album, with most of the lyric videos and music videos being made a Blender, just kinda looks like shit. It's not a bad album at all, I still enjoy it, but I really don't think it's at all emblematic of everything's appeal. There's just so much more to their sound than what's present here, and I just feel like they're capable of doing much better than this.
Wait a second.
This one took a few listens to grow on me, but I would say it had a pretty significant hand in contributing to their popularity, especially with some of the singles associated with it. And despite how low it is on this list, it is a solid cut, with easily some of my favorite work from them yet, which is displayed pretty strongly from the first track. Cough Cough starts with these heavy drum beats that get more steady as the song kicks off, with Higgs' first verse talking about selling your liver to the black market, yet still feeling in the red or financially in debt. Straightforward symbolism is represented by colors to make a statement about how dependent we are on money and how desperate for it people tend to get. I love the vocal harmonies in the back before we kick off into this really nice bass riff during the bridge, as Higgs elaborates on this further before we get this deep synth transitioning smoothly into the chorus. I love the jittery mellotron notes zigzagging every which way before we just explode with this euphoric bass number, paired with this beautiful, jingling atmosphere glaring above it. I also think the occasional series of notes on the guitar between every measure really tighten the sound very well. He correlates the evils of our dependence on money with being chased by the police, stating that by the time you realize what it turns you into, it's far too late. They've got you in their grasp. Aside from how cursed the glass jar lyric is, which is only really a problem because I have internet brain, this is a pretty straightforward reference to The Bell Jar by Sylvia Plath, in which she talks about her depression. In some ways, that could be read as Higgs stating that we're trapped, like some part of a collection, with information being fed to us like a tube full of black oil, as indicated by the music video, which is fantastic, by the way. Essentially, the point that this chorus is trying to illustrate boils down to how often we recognize consumerism as harmful, yet never do anything about it, which is tragic because there really isn't anything that can be done about it unless everyone unanimously decides to take that step. The heavy drums and background vocal harmonies return as Higgs starts his second verse, describing a machine run by cogs sitting next to a trench in order to illustrate the impending doom this brings upon us. He expresses his desperation to see the end, admitting that he would burn to break away and waste his years in order to escape this cycle of climbing the ladder and putting oneself in debt. As far as introduction tracks go, we're already off to a pretty strong start. It's extremely detailed with a lot of very interesting ideas that I don't see focused on in many indie pop songs. Kimosabe starts with these vocals drowned in this digital reverb bouncing back and forth between speakers as this sharp synth hovers over these punchy drums. Higgs talks about a restrictive relationship, feeling trapped between four walls and pulling the trigger or ending the relationship despite how dependent the character is on them. He uses a figurative border to announce that he's feeling like this relationship is just barely hanging off the edge. The bass line enters in pretty smoothly, jumping in every so often for this clean barrage of notes in order to carry us into the chorus, which is this euphoric, jingling, atmospheric wave of sound in the background as Higgs delivers these yelpy vocals about feeling alone. If the title wasn't already an indicator, there are a lot of striking references to the Lone Ranger. The song ends with this really smooth breakdown on the bass as the dramatic guitar appears in, with Higgs getting more sad and melancholic as he sings about being haunted by his partner's ghost and feeling somewhat lost now that relationship is over. It's a gorgeous moment for the song, but all in all, this track isn't nearly as detailed or exciting as the one preceding it. It's definitely a lot more low-key, but I think it illustrates the variety this album will have very well. Torso of the Week starts off with a steady drum clap alongside these bells before the subtle synth eases in gently. This track's a little more odd with the lyricism, describing a woman who continues to go to the gym every other day but makes no progress, which is also represented by the pre-chorus, which is surprisingly underwhelming. It's just this bass guitar as Higgs' vocal delivery slows down and becomes more quiet. It starts to build and build until we get to the actual chorus, which is the super vibrant guitar wailing out over these forceful drums. There's a lot of attention to detail there that I really like a lot. My favorite part is the breakdown at the end with the guitars getting increasingly dramatic. Lyrically, it's nothing to write home about compared to Cough Cough, but sonically, it definitely has a lot more going for it than Kimosabe. Duet is my second favorite song on the whole thing, inspired by one of the few Beatles songs that I actually like. Eleanor Rigby. There's this fast-paced, energetic violin with even more of those electronic synths we love stacking on top of each other in the background. This, as well as the vocal delivery from every member, definitely makes this one of the most gorgeous songs on the listing. Higgs sings about feeling out of touch, or like it's difficult to stay current in an ever-changing society. He stated in interviews that this song is about watching the world come to an end with someone you love at your side. Basically, I interpret this particular song as a realization that someday all of this will be over and we will all be dead. Over the course of the song, he begins to accept this impending doom, at the very least acknowledging that his life did have a meaning, despite the fact that time stops for no man. It's a pretty grim track, but I love the beautiful and euphoric ensemble to accompany it. The chorus is extremely catchy and clean with these dramatic thrusts and satisfying vocal harmonies. I love how theatrical the bridge at the end is as well. It's easily a highlight for this album. Choice Mountain starts with these clean guitars before transitioning to this crisp bass riff and then suddenly moving into these glistening strings as Higgs sings about how depression can make one stick to their own with no motivation to change their condition. He equates this pretty directly to evolution, as if wanting to make that leap but just simply not knowing, which is pretty accurate. The drums get a bit more steady as Higgs metaphorically compares himself to a limbless star, furthering the evolution imagery by equating the uncertainty of this egg's fate to feeling in doubt of what the future holds and keeping to your own. I think the sudden shift in musical style might correlate in some way with both the stages of evolution as well as the endless cycle of torment that depression puts people through. It's definitely one of the more complex songs, the lyrics feeling a little vague, but the moody and dramatic tone remains consistent despite the jarring beat switch-ups. We return back to the bass riff at the start, with Higgs lamenting that he's not interesting to anybody with his deepest desires, exhibiting how the character in the song accepts that they have a lot of potential, but putting himself on such an unreal standard that it almost seems kind of sad. Then all those pieces of the song that were given to you in bite-sized chunks come together as one in the frankly gorgeous chorus, where Higgs sings about choosing to not give up on his dreams, despite how unrealistic they become every single day. This wall of synths join in for the second verse to really tighten things up as Higgs gets a bit more hopeless and cynical, feeling tired of this consistent and repetitive cycle, but despite how hard things get, he still feels confident that he has potential to do better, and holds on to that belief as we travel into this absolutely euphoric wall of atmosphere as Higgs sings out before returning back to the chorus once more. It's definitely one of the prettiest and most moody tracks on the listing, but what really makes it stand out is how creative and unique it is. I've never heard anything like this save for bits and pieces of Radiohead, and even then it doesn't quite replicate the unique lyricism and bizarre beat changes. Feet for Hands starts with this sharp acoustic guitar riff joined by an electric one shortly after, and some more of those thick booming drums we love so much as Higgs delivers some of his most dramatic vocals yet, paired with some occasional backup choir. I don't have much to say about the lyrics of this song, as catchy as it is. It's pretty straightforwardly about David Rathband, who was shot and blinded in 2010. He would later commit suicide because of this incident. It's tragic regardless, but it's not a story I've researched extensively, so it's difficult for me to fully internalize the emotional slant this song comes from. I do like the choice to title it Feet for Hands, as it once again reinforces the themes of evolution present in every song here. In this particular sense, I think it might be correlating his need to adjust his blindness with our need for change. This incident happened because of the tough gun laws at the time, with police stating that it isn't just the task force that was in trouble with this whole fiasco. That being said, I did like the bouncy electronic notes on the chorus, sort of dancing in the background over the drums drowned in reverb. I also like how it builds and builds until we return to the dramatic second verse. It's very pretty and easily one of the most catchy songs yet. Undrowned is also fantastic, being easily one of the most dramatic and infectious tracks on the listing. It's a jarringly haunting song that almost has a fairy tale nursery rhyme-esque vibe going for it. He sings about how power is given to those too irresponsible to handle it, as well as how we sensationalize things like capital, warmongering, and abuse. It's easily one of the most politically charged tracks since Cough Cough, with some of my favorite lyricism yet. I especially love the imagery presented in the bridge, depicting a billionaire with his innards nailed to the walls, particularly for the subtle reference to Batman, but I also adore the dramatic delivery from Higgs. The hypnotic electronic piano bouncing from side to side, paired with the satisfying guitar twisting and turning in the background. This track builds and builds as it goes, and the next thing you know, it's just a big dramatic wave of synths and bass. But the song is at its absolute best when the drums carry us into the climactic descent. It has easily the best pacing yet. Now, you're probably confused at this album being so low, because up until this point, it's a pretty solid release, albeit not that emotionally resonant with me. But the second half of this particular album just starts to drag a bit. The second leg is significantly weaker than the first. The title track is only a minute and a half long with these grating shrieks. The violins are nice, but that's just not enough to this song that really justifies its existence, especially since the drums are so distant and zoned out. It also gets drowned in way too much reverb as the song goes on before it becomes somewhat overwhelming. Armorland has this bouncy, glitchy fusion of techno and ambience made complete with a cowbell and some subtle drums. Sonically, there's not much to it that I find interesting until we get to the hook, which is actually pretty damn good. I love the serene and somber delivery from Higgs over these digital plucks and gorgeous synths. The House's Dust begins with these booming drums echoing out over this horn, slowly making its way alongside some bass, so drowned in reverb that it can't breathe. They try to go for another serene and euphoric track, but this is easily the least memorable one on the entire album, with tired delivery from Higgs and everything completely blown out to the point it just sounds a bit dry and stale. Lyrically, it is a little compelling as it details the feeling of dejection one gets when a couple divorces and how that affects the family and so on, but it doesn't cover this in much detail, pretty much just skimming over all of it. It just doesn't feel very passionate compared to many of the tracks at the start. Radiant has more of an upbeat glow to it with these jolly guitars and old school synths that kick things back into high gear. I like the bouncy digital notes and energetic delivery. The bridge has this fantastic euphoric ascent into greatness with the drums just going crazy. Lyrically, this track is about hunger for knowledge to the point that you almost lose your sanity in not being able to understand the universe or how it works. Not to say that researching it is bad, just that sometimes it's easy to get frustrated at what little we actually know, or just how insignificant our existence truly is. The Peaks is unfortunately yet another song that doesn't stick with me. It's painfully slow, taking almost a whole minute to start before we get into some bland piano notes and lyrics about how the world is just so messed up. He at one point laments that he's seen more villages burn than animals born, or more towers come down than children grow up. It's just a song about God watching the progress of the human race, how we're capable of such great things, but instead just look for newer, better ways to kill each other. Pretty generic, nothing that hasn't been said before, but the lyrics are okay. It's just the instrumental I found kind of dull. It's more of the same with these generic synths, bass guitars drowned in reverb, and unfortunately, even more tired delivery from Higgs. It tries to sum up everything the album has been about up until this point, but it just feels a little repetitive by now. Like, the point's already been made a ton of times, and there's just nothing this track offers that wasn't already present for, like, the whole thing. But luckily, one of the best songs actually ends up being the final track, Don't Try. I like the old school beat and dramatic digital vocals in the background, as well as the guitars flickering about alongside the chorus. It's very upbeat and detailed, constantly switching it up between these two styles before slowing down for the chorus with the plucked strings and aggressive synths. It's easily some of the catchiest shit on the album. Lyrically, it's pretty straightforward. Don't bottle up your emotions because you'll just blow up in the end. It's a very positive conclusion despite the depressing and dark topics that have taken up the album thus far. I would say it's definitely my second favorite track right behind Cough Cough. Arc is a great album, but the second leg just really doesn't feel too memorable. Writing this video, I had a ton of fun with the first 7 tracks, and then as time went on, it just became a slog to get through, and I always find myself skipping those later tracks because it just starts to feel longer than it really needs to be, but it still manages to end on a really good note with one of the better songs in the track listing. There's not a lot of variety in the aesthetic, but Arc manages to leave behind a pretty good impression. Cough Cough also feels somewhat misleading as a single because the rest of the album is not made with this kind of raw and exciting energy, so unfortunately, as much as I understand why it's one of their more popular releases, Arc feels a bit overcooked. I think it definitely could have stayed at about 38 minutes or so instead of almost being an hour, and that's without the deluxe tracks. So when I first started this list, A Fever Dream was much lower on the ranking because I thought it was a bit generic, but honestly after a few listens to this thing, I have no idea why people would rank this album so low. It's not nearly as memorable as the rest of their work, but it's definitely not as bland or mediocre as I've seen people say. Night of the Long Knives has this shifty, clicking electronic rhythm supplemented by clean synths and bass, the usual go-to. It's very cinematic and dramatic, especially with Higgs performing so passionately. I love the digital effect on his vocals during the chorus, as well as the sassy guitar strum during the verses. It's very fucking catchy right from the get-go. They really put a lot into this one track with the booming drums and electronic supports. Can't Do continues this electronic funkiness with these syncopated notes billowing over Higgs' vocal delivery. The drums somehow make me think of Aphex Twin, He sounds cool and laid back with these gorgeous vocal harmonies supporting his pre-chorus. It builds nicely into the hook with these tight guitar tones and synths that sound somewhat reminiscent of what they did on their first album. I have never heard such a catchy song specifically about writer's block. Yeah, this song's about writer's block, I'm not kidding. The high energy is amped up even further with Desire's confidence and captivating hook. The bass is super distorted and blown out with these sharp and compressed guitars and drum claps as Higgs just bellows out passionately. The breakdown at the end kind of reminds me of 21 Pilots and maybe a little bit of Coldplay. It is a little generic, but I can't pretend it's not catchy. Then it gets immediately mellowed out by Big Game, which is a little one note and unmemorable. Higgs drags out notes longer than they need to be in order to make them fit, and I'm not really a fan of the drums being so much louder than everything else. The pretty synths and tambourines and all the interesting little details are all just kind of playing second fiddle to these drums and Higgs' somewhat forced performance. But things pick back up with Good Shot, Good Soldier, which has this nice digital shift supported by a pretty solid atmospheric wave. Higgs also has more of those charming, fast-paced lyrics about power and how we decide who deserves to have it. But the best part of the track is the fantastic chorus, which is this super dramatic ascent into heaven with these gorgeous drones and fast-paced percussion. Run the Numbers is also pretty decent with the building percussion and dream pop-esque direction the song seems to be taking. They add more tambourines and hypnotizing sequences with these occasional drones waving past subtly. It's really fucking good, sort of reminding me of a more sassy British version of something like Turnover. But the chorus is just really weak with more of this repetitive and obnoxious bass just being so compressed and blown out that it makes my ears bleed. Higgs really tries to lay on the dramatic tone, but it does sound like he's struggling a bit, even if the chorus is pretty catchy. It transforms from the really pretty sounds in the verse to this extremely obnoxious attempt to replicate White Stripes. Put Me Together elaborates on this dream pop style even more with the strange backwards vocals being played before we ease into the beat rather smoothly. The drum taps are gentle and the synths are sweet. Higgs sounds really sad and defeated. It's actually pretty powerful. The song also has one of the stronger choruses on the listing as well. It's a pretty straightforward track about how we're all pretty much the same despite our differences by referencing the normal things we do every day. The breakdown halfway through where the song begins to fall apart with this strange fuzz traveling back and forth is really bizarre and mesmerizing, but I especially love how it all builds into the climax with just the clicking electronic drum before everything jumps right back in at once. It kind of reminds me of American football, which might seem like a strange comparison, but it has that level of detail and emotion. A Fever Dream has this singing choir and melancholic piano that I enjoyed quite a bit. The opening is a bit long-winded, but the chorus is somewhat enjoyable as it switches into this pretty decent rhythm with all these electronic inflections just stacking on top of each other. But did this track really need to be 6 minutes long? It's super repetitive, and it has like one lyric just repeated again and again. Then at the end they don't really know what to do with it, so they just spam these weird bells and bizarre digital effects to remind you how experimental this is supposed to be. But things pick back up with Ivory Tower's Get to Heaven-esque energy and delivery. It's really tight with the guitar tones and crazy good performance from Higgs. I love the ringing bass and fast pace going for it. Just seeing the title of this track has it playing in my head pretty vividly. It's one of the most memorable and fun tracks on the listing. New Deep is the worst offender with the bad attempt at slow dramatic pacing just serving as this nothing sandwich. It's really drab and boring, only lasting 2.5 minutes as an unnecessary and bland lead-in for the following track, which clears it by a long shot. It's just repetitive and dull. It ends before it even goes anywhere. It feels like they really didn't try hard with this one. That being said, White Whale is the prettiest track on the listing, kind of reminding me of something from Damon Albarn's solo career. I love the gorgeous symphonic notes as well as the xylophone they added in. Felt like a nice touch. I know I've compared them to Radiohead, but this track really doesn't make that avoidable because it literally feels like a Radiohead song as it keeps building with this wave of dramatic harmony, but I absolutely enjoyed the climax regardless. A Fever Dream is much more likable and fun to sit through than the albums that have been discussed up until this point. And there's definitely a lot more to it that sticks with me than Arc or Re-Animator because as an album it's a lot more consistent than those releases. It's also a lot more accessible and easier to get into, but the reason it's not any higher on this list just has to do with the fact that it's not particularly special. There's seldom that I can get from this album that I wouldn't already get from artists like Radiohead or Gorillaz, but done like, 100 times better. While this album is pretty good and has a lot of decent sounds, There isn't much going for it thematically or sonically that makes it stand out in the sea of pop albums we get everywhere, which is a bit disheartening when you consider the bizarre and unique ideas present on the two albums I discussed from before. I only put it higher than those because of its stability and cohesion, and I do think it's a good album, I just don't find myself attached to it. You probably guessed that this is where Man Alive would end up, but I promise there's more depth to its placement here than just the fact that it is their debut album. The thing is, this thing is sonically gorgeous, and the most unique album I've heard in a long time, and while it's not my favorite, it is one of the best things they released, as well as one of my favorite albums from that respective year. Lyrically, it has much more personality and interesting topics going for it than Fever Dream, but sonically it's also way more experimental and out there with its sound. While their later release, Arc, did have some bizarre ideas, it still, for the most part anyway, just feels a little too accessible. Like, it's bad that my favorite song on the album can be compared to Imagine Dragons. Man Alive, on the other hand, feels like there was a lot more put into it, as if they just did whatever they wanted without a care in the world for how others would feel about it. My KZ, Your BF is a fantastic starter track, beginning with these glistening violins and fuzzy synths before transitioning into this super clean wave of digital bliss. I like the retro style with some nods to vaporwave and art pop, but what really gets me is the hypnotizing, exhilarating guitar drowned in reverb and echoing out over the sea of ecstasy. It's super detailed and clean, not to mention very psychedelic and raw. I like the fast-paced notes during the verses to keep the energy going despite the mellowed-out tone. Higgs' vocal delivery is really eccentric and unique. He just lets out notes like an alarm with no filter, but it's so lovable and charming I just can't help but enjoy it. Lyrically, the song is pretty complex, and it's also about American issues, hilariously enough. Basically, it juxtaposes our violent nature in war to the strange comfy feeling we have in sitcoms because America seems to embrace both of those things. QWERTY Finger is one of my personal favorite songs from the entirety of Everything's discography with its fast-paced percussion and crazy energetic style. It kind of reminds me of the F-Zero soundtrack, oddly enough. The booming drums and zestful guitar strums as Higgs just goes nuts. But the chorus is the best part. It just has this super satisfying build-up, exploding into this haphazard series of guitar licks, spurts of drum notes, and Higgs just letting notes out like a maniac. The track's lyrics aren't anything special, it's just about how much technology has advanced, but my god, it has no right slapping this fucking hard. Schoolin' has this mischievous little synth jingle that plays every couple of measures. It's pretty cute, especially with the unpredictable structure of the song sounding so unlike anything I've ever heard. The transition into 80s inspired guitar notes is really nice. I love the guitars that glitch out in the background, as well as the smooth grooves on the verses. Then things build into the haphazard, controlled chaos of the breakdown with all these glitchy beat shifts before an admittedly pretty fire coda. I love the punchy, confident delivery from Higgs, as well as the effects on the guitars from the breakdown. Obviously, the track is about learning from your mistakes, hence the title Schoolin'. Leave the Engine Room is a little more low-key, with this slow-paced Toby Fox-esque beat. Higgs sounds fucking depressed on this one. I initially thought the song was about abortion, but it really isn't. It's just about white guilt and passing our shitty actions down to our children. I do like that it builds more on itself halfway through by adding in this ringing drone and echoing drum. It's catchy, but it's really strange in presentation. Final Form starts with these twirling guitar notes before ascending into this tranquil hook. I absolutely adore the hazy mellotron notes and passion in Higgs' voice. We cycle through it a couple times, and then this aggressive bass just joins in so casually. It's really strange. Then the track ends with this weirdly creepy, glitchy synth as Higgs sounds like he's dying. It ends on this super bizarre, atmospheric note with these distant voices speaking out, which is a bit fitting for the lyrics about using your body while you still can, because someday it's going to stop working the way it used to. This creepy part at the end could represent death or just your body shutting down. You will notice I've been making a lot of video game comparisons, and they're directly referenced in Photoshop Handsome, where the first lyrics are literally, "I will gain an extra life when I get the high score." That being said, it's another fast-paced, forceful, vigorous track with the thick drums and steady synths. Nothing we haven't seen already, but it is damn catchy. I just love how it gets more vibrant as it goes. It's just really cute. While on that same subject of video game references, 2 for Nero is a more emotional track, but it sounds like something straight out of a medieval RPG game, as well as a direct reference to the Game Gear from Sega. Of all the instruments I expected to hear on this indie album, a lute was not one of them. It's a song about nostalgia and getting increasingly worried as you grow up with all the horrible things that happen in the world, with some tongue-in-cheek references to global warming and how we should save the planet. Definitely the most lyrically based track they've done yet. It's still a weird track sonically with the flutes and shit, but I have to admit they did make it pretty good. Suffragette is the title of an actual song on this album from an artist called Everything Everything, but it does have a pretty solid bass lead with some reverb on Higgs' vocals. It's got more of that fast-paced vigor you come to expect from their later work. Kind of reminds me of what they did on Get to Heaven with the soaring chorus and gorgeous structure. The guitar strums are solid as fuck and hit like a damn truck when they take full focus. It weirdly reminds me of the Mars Volta's Francis the Mute, the title track, where there's that huge breakdown. It's a pretty straightforward track, but the bass on the song is fucking amazing with how overwhelming and intense it is, especially in the second half of the song. Come Alive Diana reuses that same loop with more of those thick booming drums and beautiful bass. I love the electronic drones and synths scattering about with the chaotic and unpredictable rhythm. There's also these trumpets that blare out in the breakdown towards the end that I think are fucking amazing. For the most part, the album is absolutely fantastic, save for the last couple tracks on the listing. NASA's On Your Side is a much slower cut, but honestly, it's a bit drab and repetitive. Doesn't really do it for me. It has these hypnotic, sleepy drones juxtaposed to even more of those booming drums, so it feels like it's trying to be both intense and calm at the same time. The chorus also fails to connect to the following verse all that well, just making the track feel like an overblown mess. Tin the Manhole is cute, oddly reminds me of something I'd hear from the Antlers. I do like the simplicity of it with the electronic notes and thudding drum claps that occasionally worm their way into the track, but it just feels so compressed and drowned in reverb that it's almost unrecognizable. It tries to feel climactic, and it hardly changes for the entire song. It just overwhelms you with all these vocal layers to the point where it becomes a tad grating. Then Waits ends the album with a pretty lovable and charming song about cutting toxic people out of your life in order to improve it. I love the upbeat energy on this one, as well as the vocal harmonies, thick bass, aggressive yet compressed drums. They even add a cute little xylophone just to put a smile on your face. It's a great way to end a relatively solid album, and I wouldn't have it any other way. My favorite part is the emotional breakdown at the end as he sings out that he knows how it ends. They really do know how to make a song memorable. Man Alive isn't a masterpiece, as a lot of it still feels like a bit of an acquired taste, but it's definitely the most high-energy project they've dropped to this day. You can tell they really put a lot into this release and wanted to burst out on the scene with a lot of energy and likability. This album really doesn't sound like anything else I've ever heard, and for that, I can't recommend it more. It does get a little bit weak and played out towards the end, but I can count on one hand the number of songs I don't like on this thing. It's just super solid.
You must have burst me out of my head. I'm wondering, how did I get?
Obviously, the second best album would be the very reason I'm bothering to make this video to start with. The brand new release that dropped at the start of this year. In light of all these deepfakes and DALL-E mini-generated art applications everybody seems to be fascinated by, Everything Everything basically made an AI-generated album. At least the lyrics on this thing are random, as are some of the visual effects in music videos or the art on the cover. All computer-generated. So don't expect me to understand the lyrics on this one, because a lot of the time they just frankly don't make any sense. This was shown by the singles, particularly Teletype, which has these somewhat grating, glitchy sounds and grooves that took me a few listens to get used to, but after you get past this somewhat rough beginning, it rewards you with some steady drums and a likable chorus. There's this unique controlled chaos to the various different electronic tones and synths as they blend together as one. I Want a Love Like This sounds a bit bland in its delivery, sounding similar to the work they did on A Fever Dream with the Half-Alive-esque mellotrons and bouncing electronics. It's not the most sonically impressive thing I've ever heard, with the corny lyrics about how you should listen to your mama because she's old. Yeah, that's a literal thing they said on this album. The beat sounds a bit compressed and inhibited, but I will admit that the chorus is very nice, with the smooth and crisp vocal harmonies paired with the reverb instilling this sense of dreamlike euphoria. I also like the heavy bass and wacky samples on the climax as well. My personal favorite track on the listing is that of Bad Friday, which has no right going as fucking hard as it does. I love the rapid-fire lyrics, thick drum claps, echoing samples, just about everything really. It builds up the tension with these dramatic, euphonious vocal harmonies before the sassy, charming series of rests and the extremely satisfying and catchy hook. I like the delightful electronic piano and how it dances alongside the bass brilliantly. It's definitely the closest thing to their old sound they've done in a while. Unfortunately, the best song does get followed up by the worst with Pizza Boy, which has the dumbest chorus I've ever heard. It literally doesn't even fucking rhyme. It's just a generic track about consumerism, but save for some of the interesting post-punk inspiration, it just doesn't do it for me. Higgs' vocals are so distant and drowned in reverb that it turns really stale and bricked out. It just sounds super flat and annoying. Luckily, things start to pick back up, with Jennifer's soft guitars and melancholic synths sounding somewhat reminiscent of Gorillaz or possibly Damon Albarn's solo work. I like the catchy little bass riff paired with the hazy vocals and blissful atmosphere. I also really like the hook to this one as as well, with the nice backup and soaring drones. It's easily one of the most gorgeous songs they've ever released. Kinda reminds me of Get to Heaven. Metroland is Burning expands on this sound even further with those same dreamy guitars rippling out vibrantly. I like the eccentric electronics paired with the fast lyrics and sassy conveyance, and my favorite part is the descent of mellotron notes after the hook. It's bulky, but memorable. The drones shuffle about indiscriminately on the verses, but transform into something more vaporwave-esque when the chorus rolls around. It's really unique and out there stylistically, but everything comes together for this dramatic expansion towards the end, with more of those steady synths and that crisp bass you come to expect. It's a solid track. Leviathan has some eerie ringing at the start before dropping into this atmospheric bass line. It's very sorrowful and hypnotic with the drifting notes and occasional piano that dips in and out of the track. Admittedly, it's not quite as memorable as much of what was present up until this point, but it's not something I find myself compelled to skip. Shark Week amps the high energy back up with some vigorous resonance sported by this really interesting vocal sample being remixed. They do a lot of really strange and creative shit on this album, and it's easily one of the most experimental releases to date. I love the conspicuous orchestra that fires out in waves, along with how confident Higgs sounds on this track, only for those dreamy synths we've been hearing all over the album to finally make their presence clear on the chorus. This one got stuck in my head for like a month when I first heard it. It's definitely a highlight, especially for the tambourine on the breakdown towards the end. There's this staggering synth that builds and builds before we return to the chorus. It's very lovable. Cut Up is really odd, almost resembling that of Aphex Twin. There's a stinging effect to the digital inflections at the start, as well as a rising synth and a cowbell for good measure. Higgs has more of those fast-paced lyrics and composed delivery. It straight up sounds like something out of the 80s with the hard-hitting rhythm. Very colorful and lively. There's a big attention to detail there. Hex is a bit slower, but it has more of that enthusiastic pop style with even more of those broad keyboard-driven tunes, although Higgs sounds like he's singing this in the shower. It's a little overcooked. That being said, I do like the flow. The clicking mellotrons, the vivacious guitars fading in and out, and Higgs just unleashing notes like a siren. It's a damn banger, I won't lie. My Computer begins with this 8-bit jingle along with some pensive bass, but if I'm being honest, the hook is a little weak. It doesn't transition well from the verse, and it's really unappealing in terms of structure. It just doesn't flow together well at all, which is jarring considering the tracks up until now have been mostly great. Like Kevin's Car, which is very serene and elated, expanding on the dreamy atmosphere that's been relatively present throughout. It begins with reggae-inspired riffs and instrumentation before it transforms into something smooth and polished. Kinda sounds like alternative rock. Sorta reminds me of Arctic Monkeys or The Strokes, a little bit of Killers if you really want to reach. Then Born Under a Meteor sounds even sleepier than anything that's been present up until now with the warped synths, doubling down on that reggae inspiration. I like the gentle grooves and tranquil riffs, as well as the somewhat eerie atmosphere fading in and out with the synths and electronics. I already made comparisons to Gorillaz, but this one definitely adds to it in that way. The Software Great Man ends things off with a drone guitar and some drum claps fading in and out. Honestly, there's very little this track offers that hasn't been present up until now. It's not super memorable, but it does take the sound of all the previous tracks and sort of puts them together in one big finale. Raw Data Feel is raw. Data Feel. And it's one of the best albums of the year so far. It's the most solid thing that Everything has dropped in a long time for both its strange experimental style as well as its personality. It's the only other album they've made that I think is genuinely on par with that of our next submission, which is unsurprisingly Get to Heaven. So here we have it, the best Everything album. Not only is this the absolute peak of their career, but it's also one of my favorite albums of all time. I first found this thing back when I was like 17 years old, and ever since then I've just been obsessed with this band. But this particular album is also one of the few releases that I think are almost perfect. I seriously love every single song on this track listing, save for a few of the extras on the deluxe edition. I don't think the word masterpiece is unfitting with this. It is genuinely an amazing album, and it's bizarre that they've only recently made something even close to this level of quality. At this point, you might be better off just listening to it instead of hearing me explain to you why it's such a great album. All of these catchy songs never overstay their welcome, and with such lovable lyrics and well-paced instrumentals, this thing is just a banger after banger, and I can't stress enough to you just how much I love it. The appeal of a band like Everything is that they have such a wide range of styles. It is pop music on the surface, but fused with things like electronica and even sometimes progressive rock, but everything feels so tight and compact. There's this strange artsy flair to it that you just don't see in other artists save for maybe Alt J or Animal Collective, but Get to Heaven displays their talents very well with the powerful rhythms and energetic drums. But this is also the release where Higgs doesn't miss a beat. He has strong vocals through the entire thing beginning to end, more of those falsettos and unpredictable rhythms, but it's all translated through a bright and colorful pop lens. To the Blade starts with these gentle and somber vocals over popping glitchy synths and clear bass. I like the VHS aesthetic, lending it a somewhat retro style. It builds and builds before just exploding into this charismatic eruption of thick booming guitar notes and aggressively loud drum beats. I love the fast-paced zigzag pattern on the guitar, as well as the choir of vocals. Then it's held up by dreamy strums and distant pianos. There's also this soaring, zestful hook and bouncing rhythm. It's just a treat, and it's amazing that this is the first fucking track. Lyrically, it is a letter dedicated to a friend who has done something unspeakably horrible. There was a rumor that it was about ISIS, but there's many different ways you can read it. While there are references to war, it's about a lot of things, particularly about how we as human beings are just content with sitting around, observing problems and issues in the world, but saying that any action to solve them is futile. This was also before 2016, and it seems like ever since then, things have only gotten worse. Distant Past has this super deep, bouncy bass rhythm as Higgs delivers these fast-paced, disjointed vocals. It's pretty simplistic, only slightly building on top of that with some backup choir and strange samples. And it's not until the hook where the guitar takes over with one of the catchiest damn things I've ever heard. The drums are hard-hitting and crisp, and there's even these mesmerizing drones hanging in the background. I especially enjoy the enraptured synths on the climax. It definitely brings things full circle in an interesting way, and it's nice to see how much more detailed the song is towards the end, as opposed to the relatively simplistic opener. It's just an explosion of hypnotic reverb and brilliant guitar strums. I just love it so much. The lyrics of this one have a lot of references to evolution and nature. This particular song is a reflection of the human race and how history seems to repeat itself a lot. How we'll read history books and see how violent we used to be, then pretend like it's different now when it really isn't. And he isn't wrong, since racism is still just as rampant today as it was in the 60s. Next is the title track, which is literally sex for the fucking ears. Holy God, like how do you even make this? It fades in with these bleeding synths and sharp electronics before kicking off into a more mellowed out and euphoric bass riff supplemented by these beautiful guitar notes that just bleed into every measure. I am so crazy about the upbeat sound juxtaposed to the kind of tragic lyrics, the whistling, even the fact that the chorus just explodes into this colorful and vibrant combination of guitar riffs, drums, electronic rhythms, and vocal harmonies. It is beautiful and catchy as well, to the point that it should be illegal. But what I love the most is how it's played so effortlessly despite the fast-paced flow. The resilient electronic notes that connect to the verses, that beautiful echo on Higgs' vocals. Having heard everything else these guys have done, I don't even understand how this song is real or what creative space they had to be in to make it, but it's easily some of the best shit I've heard in a long time. There's even a great guitar solo at the end that just wraps everything together in a charismatic bow. It's just so damn cute. It's a shame this song is about death and how you can literally die anytime at any day. I interpret it as a positive reflection of this, however, basically saying to live every day like it's your last. But as if that's not already impressive, the next song is Regret, which is a track that had a lot of significance in my life, and I don't think I need to explain why, given it's pretty obvious what this song is about, but I'll do it anyway because I just felt like gushing. Higgs takes the initiative of talking about moving on from past mistakes, asking if you imagined it happening any other way. This particular track helped me cope with a relationship of mine that failed. The sugary sweet chorus, brittle drums, and strained tambourines, along with more layered vocals and anthemic guitars, really makes it stand out. I also love how the bass builds and builds into the hook with this ignition of synthesizers and thick bass, and I just really adore how emotional the bridge to this song is with the psychedelic guitar and wavering rhythms. Higgs really has some of his best vocal performances on this album, and this is obviously no exception. On top of sad, relatable songs, they have a somehow even better one afterwards called Spring Sun Winter Dread. And fuck, dude, like, they can't keep getting away with this. I really adore the clicking drums and shuffling synths paired with the plucked strings and distant mumbling. Higgs is really loud and passionate, but also sounds really pained and sad on this track. If it's not obvious, this song is about fear of growing old and aging. I love the reggae-inspired hook, backup harmonies, shuffling guitars. It's very cloying with the flamboyant and aesthetically pleasing structure, but the best part is that insane guitar work on the closer with the super catchy bridge. Yes, the lyrics are a little bit nonsensical and silly, but crazy good. The wheel is turning now. It begins with even more of those shuffling synths and gloomy bass and the sassy humming paired with the vivacious tempo, especially on the point right after the hook, is very nice. It has a good structure with the build-up of tension before the somewhat relaxed but effective chorus, and I really admire the dreamy guitars bouncing off of each other in the background. It's truly a strong moment, but what really sells it for me is the blown-out bass on the bridge to the climax with the ringing synth and compressed electronics as Higgs just sounds defeated. Lyrics on this one apply to corruption in leaders, vague reference to UKIP and racism. It's also a very politically driven track, much like what was present on their previous work at this point, but it sounds very somber, as if realizing that we reward scum in our society, and there really is nothing that can be done about it. Not on a large scale, anyway. Fortune 500 synths are a little different from what was present up until now. While everything else has been exultant with a sense of ascension and euphoria, even the sad songs, this one feels a little more grim. It kind of sounds like a siren from a police car, but it's also compressed and distant, as if peering into the scenario from far away. Higgs sounds distraught and traumatized, with his voice very low and off-kilter. There's these rattling drums that come out on occasion, the thick reverb adding a dramatic atmosphere on top of the constant building of booming percussion and bass. The compression slowly fades away as the song gets more and more vivid in its unsettling imagery, even introducing some horns to really breathe emotion into it. But my favorite part of the song is hearing Higgs and the rest declare victory as the synths rise and build this sense of tension that just gets higher and higher before just releasing with more of those police sirens from before. This is the most miserable track on the listing, as it's about a character attempting some kind of assassination, and a very gruesome one at that, as they have the intention of drilling a hole into the Queen's head. There are a lot of dark, meaningful lyrics, as the main character of this song realizes the gravity of what they've done, and announces their political victory, as it's the only thing they have left as they're carried away by police. Blast Doors is a lot more aggressive and visceral with these sharp guitar notes and steady drum taps. The subtle bass riff enters the track about 15 seconds in and continues to build until more layers of percussion are added on before just exploding into the hook as Higgs sings out loudly over these fast-paced guitars and a wall of synths. I love the echo on his vocals, the psychedelic inflections, and so on. The instrumental is a bit more energetic in the second verse, but the best part is the theatrical atmosphere towards the end with the synths all ringing out at once, just scrambling my brain. There's even a gorgeous organ and some sharp crash cymbals every couple of measures. It's just a wall of sound that I admire so much. Zero Pharaoh has these grimy electronics feeling very eclectic and hazy. On your first listen, it's a tad grating, but the drums really tighten it up in a great way. It has easily some of the best guitar work with these droning, fast-paced rhythms played effortlessly, and there's also this nice vocal harmony on the hook as it builds and builds before this satisfying payoff. No Reptiles is one of my favorite songs on the listing, with this hypnotic vocals and bouncy mellotrons, very colorful and serene, despite the lyrics not making a ton of sense. It's still played very emotionally, which is nice. And then you have Warm Healer, which is a nice closer. Very pretty and slow, but it doesn't have much to it that makes it as interesting as what was present up until this point. Get to Heaven's worst moments are all still relatively good. It just has a solid aesthetic that I find myself coming back to even years later, and I have yet to see them ever top this again. And with that, that is my listing. Did you agree? Did you disagree? Comment your own ranking. And stay tuned for the next video. I got a lot coming out. I really wanted to make a video about everything. Originally, this was going to be just an analysis of Get to Heaven, but I really wanted to talk about everything else they've done because I thought it was just so worth the trouble, even though this video took way longer to make than I had initially intended. I started this video when the fucking newest album came out, and here we are, like, in the second half of the year, still fucking making this video, and only just now recording it. So, yeah, pretty ridiculous, but, yeah, stay tuned for the next video. I got a lot planned, and, yeah, see you next time.